OG Rose, and today we're going to be talking about part 4 of Real Speculations, Social Analysis, and Civilizational Real. We've already gone through the importance of Hegel as foundations, Nietzsche as dry myths, and here we're going to be focusing on social analysis. And I am personally quite partial to thinking of psychoanalysis as a social analysis, a sociological. I think that is very, very important. I think you can find in Lacan sociological thinking that is extremely consequential and extremely valuable and extremely useful. And I think also someone like Lacan, when thought through sociology, or quote-unquote social analysis, is going to show how much we have to think the social in terms of the libidinal, libido, and that if we don't, like, so much of sociological analysis is, say, maybe about power or hierarchy or dominance or oppression. And of course that's all very important and that's all very real, but also a lot of the mechanisms of oppression come out of repression of libido and not coming to terms with libido and that particular energy that drives human subjectivity, and that humans, if they don't integrate with lack, are going to be driven by that libido to avoiding the real, which will contribute to avoiding difference and all the trouble that come from that. And I do think Philip Rieff, who is a major catalyst for belonging again, part 1, he wants us to think society through Freud and psychoanalysis and to think of it more libidinal. And I think Cadell is right. But of course, here's another issue. Without Hegelian foundations and Hegelian logic, one could argue we simply have not had the foundations for thinking libidinal economy. And so that's why Cadell has also done this work of really working from the ground up. Like, if so much now rides on the movement between religion with Jordan Peterson and absolute knowing with Zizek and Christian atheism, then ultimately that suggests, like, that very movement is a libidinal movement, having to think the libidinal, but that would require the correct dialectical thinking and speculative reason that Hegel affords. And if you don't have that, then at best religion is what you can do in Hegel's phenomenological journey. That's the best you can do. And if that's not good enough, then our situation is quite dire. But then, of course, when you use Hegelian foundations with the libidinal, you need a proper drive myth to keep you going, if you will, to be rightly motivated with that combination. And if you don't have the right drive myth, even if you have the foundations, you might not have the correct narrative by which to think of the process of tearing with negativity that comes with the libidinal, and as a result, the process could just destroy you. Cadell writes here, to open, the libido is most fundamentally defined as psychic sexual energy. There are two ways into understanding the concept of libido qua psychic sexual energy as it appears at the ground of psychoanalytical thought, specifically starting with Freud. We can think of it as life force, derived from a physics metaphor, or as eros, derived from Greek mythology. When we think about libido as life force, we are thinking about somatic energy flows that move through bodily orifices and generate tensions, both developmentally as well as structurally. So there's a movement of a life force that is always having to pass through, it's having to be regulated, it's having to be tarried with, and we have to think about the sociological order as profoundly constructed to deal with libido and this movement. Because otherwise what you end up doing is saying, oh, well, maybe society is about, fighting chaos and, order and chaos, right? Yeah, okay, that's religion with Peterson. We've talked about that, but that's only one side of it. And what do you, in the libidinal, the hero can become a dragon. The very logic of the hero can become a dragon. It's not hero versus dragon. Libidinal energy can have this great inversion that occurs. What then, right? Some people talk about society as, in more economic terms, the distribution of limited resources. Well, or, providing avenues of fulfillment. Well, then the role of society is to give people toys, objects, ways to survive. And of course, a society needs to do that. But if it gives people everything they need to survive, then they have to ask the question of what are they surviving for? And then maybe we'll say, well, it's for a new car or some sort of object of desire. Well, then if they find out, no object of desire fulfills me, what then? Well, now you're having to change your relationship with desire as such. You're having to change your relationship with libidinal as such. And that's where you're going to have to be wrestling with what Cadell is talking about. And I think it's certainly the case that we are in a historic period that necessitates tearing with the libidinal. And if we don't do that, we are going to be in trouble. And so I think it's very important. Cadell writes here, we must learn to love the process, as is commonly emphasized today, and this is on page 542. But with a higher logic of renunciation and sacrifice, we can become short-sighted and too narrowly focused. So without a higher logic, we can become too narrowly focused on what is and what we think we want, as opposed to what is possible but beyond our vision, and what we might enjoy in the future but not know that we want now. So I've spoken with Owen in the Agon about the difference between, walls, objects, and horizons. We associated horizons as being thematic. I think loving the process is going to move us toward being horizon subjects, horizon beings, versus logos or desire. And if we, like Eros, I think we can think of objects, logos as walls, themos as walls. As horizons, and so we need to be more horizontal beings, and that's libidinal. But how do we train that? And we really don't have a social order that have thought libidinal enough to help us tarry with that. I think people in the social coordination mechanism are doing it, but they have to do it by their own initiative. To be precise, without a large-scale ethic of renunciation and sacrifice for what is larger than our psyche, our society quickly falls into the perverted instrumentalization of pleasure, which leads us nowhere but into a deadly jouissance, excess of pleasure. Is this not the perfect description for a society that has fallen so deeply into the immediacy of a screen attention economy? Yeah. And you could say that society has to provide people ways to sacrifice. And an appeal of religion in Peterson is it provides a way to sacrifice. We have a certain drive to sacrifice, to give something up. And if society doesn't offer that, then we're in trouble. I mean, part of the issue is, too, and Jacques and Michelle and I were talking about this today, is if society provides increasing choice, then every sacrifice is just a personal preference. And so it's hard to gain virtue because it's just what you want to do. Like, the example, that came up is if you can use an epidural, then where's the honor and virtue in, not using an epidural? It just seems kind of stubborn and backwards to not use it. So virtue arises in a response to a determination. If you are forced to face a suffering you didn't choose, then virtue can come out. But if you face a suffering that you caused because you were stupid, it's not so able to create virtue, right? So as society creates more and more choice, it creates more optionality, it becomes more and more difficult to get virtue, which basically means it becomes more difficult to find means of sacrifice. And the libidinal requires sacrifice, or else we get destroyed by our drive for pleasure. And so the libidinal and virtue go together, and ultimately I think they go together in beauty. But if we can't think this, then we're going to be stuck basically increasing choice, because choice is consent and that's ethical, so it becomes ethical to increase choice. We will ethically increase choice at the expense of the possibility of virtue, which will then leave us libidinally off because we're looking for something to sacrifice. And that's when we'll easily sacrifice ourselves for, say, a strongman or some big other, and then we become manipulatable by the logic of capital or government or something, and that becomes very important. And look, Cadell also just makes the case that the stakes of this problem are ultimately going to be tied to the future of children, sexual relationships, families, communities, small businesses, networks, or larger public and private entities, the future of love in general. He talks about this on page 544. So the demographic consequences are staggering, and the creative consequences are staggering of not taking the libidinal serious. But what's very interesting is that the libidinal is addressed when thought of as a certain impossibility. Like, you can't finish the libidinal, you can't fulfill it. It is a constant, unending drive. The question is simply, what are you going to do about that? Like, when are you gonna tie it to? There's a way in which the death drive can be confusing, because there's one interpretation of that, which is the idea that we are driven to death. We'll just keep doing it even if it kills us. There's another saying that the death drive moves us toward totalizations that are impossible, so it becomes self-effacing. I think about the self-effacing drive. But there's something about the death drive that can also be sacrificial in the sense of what are you willing to die for? And ultimately, we need to be willing to die for something that's impossible for us to be finished with. And so, in a sense, our goal is impossible. And yet that very impossibility of the goal then is why it can address the libidinal and then lead to intrinsic motivation. There's a way in which, if I talk about beauty, there's an impossibility of ever being finished with beauty because there's always excess, there's always more drive, and there's a strike of beauty. And whatever I know of beauty, there's more to know. So there's a certain impossibility to the completion of beauty, but that's exactly what the libidinal needs if it's going to be intrinsically motivated. And also, there's something about where this thought about the impossibility being good is also going to follow from the acceptance of the impossibility of, say, sex as a total unity. There is no, if sex is something which is impossible as unity, Cadell then writes, and finds only its results through libidinal in either the discovery of the split antagonism of the two or the production of the three through the two, the child, then the fierce struggle is most fundamentally on the level of self-repelling unity, the one in the lack-death drive to enjoy speech itself. So this is kind of a critical move. So if sex's total unity is impossible, then it begs the question of, okay, well, what is the libidinal for? And perhaps it is to be toward an impossibility that we come to enjoy. And what's very interesting is that there's a certain sublimation and sublation of sex into speech that Lacan identifies, that we can come to enjoy speech as much as sex. And actually, then you could even say that retrospectively that works back on sex and makes it more enjoyable. Like, I think couples can talk about, like, if you come to actually be able to talk with one another, then that actually enhances sex and that enhances speech and on and on and on, right? So there's kind of, I think, a feedback loop that occurs here in intercourse that Lacan is pointing to. But that's only going to occur with a proper acceptance of the impossibility of completeness. But the impossibility of completeness is precisely the invitation to forever grow. And there's something about beauty as an ever-deepening mystery that aligns with that, and that's also going to suggest, I think, why Eros in Dante leads to the beatific vision, because sex and beauty have to go together, or sex becomes, well, empty. And you see many, people, data shows people aren't having sex. And I think Zupancha's work, and Cadell will talk about Zupancha on page 26, also points to why people are going to stop having sex, because really the experience of sex is the experience of incompleteness. And, so he talks about in What is Sex this idea that the revelation of sex as an encounter with incompleteness was locked into marriage, because if it wasn't, and everyone was having sex and they encountered this, the trauma of the realization could destroy the social order. So everything could fall apart. So there was a kind of containment of the revelation into marriage, right? And that the exclusivity of sex in marriage was a kind of container for the revelation of incompleteness. Well, now everyone knows. Now it's unleashed, and so the experience of incompleteness is greater. And the key is that if you're going to realize everything is incomplete, you're going to really, really need to be prepared for that. You need the virtue and the character to encounter that and to not be nihilistic or hopeless or give up on relationships because of that. You need to be ready to supplement and sublate it into conversation and interaction. And if you can't do that, then the revelation will be completely self-destructive. And I like what Cadell writes on Zupancha and Judith Butler. I think this is extremely important. And I think also having to think Deleuze with Butler is very important. And the difference between, say, becoming other and becoming animal that Deleuze puts forth, and how this is a different approaches to the libidinal, that if we don't take the different approaches to we're going to have some approach to libido. We can't help but have some approach. And basically, if we don't think it in terms of ever becoming other, it's just going to end up in problematic forms that ultimately will destroy social intelligibility, in my opinion. But of course, this all comes down to, as Cadell puts on 564, we're basically asking, is it possible to improve repression? Can you have better forms of repression? And I would say yes, that drive that is channeled toward the beautiful will entail repression, but it will be better repression than just the repression of not thinking about something. Like, it's unveiling, with the UN in parentheses. As I spoke about at the conference, Writing for a First Cause, there's a difference between the repression of pure veiling then it would seem like the answer is unveiling, pure unveiling, but no, we want to be skillful in veiling so that we are not destroyed by the thing we are unveiling. And I think that's getting at what it means to have better repression today. I like what Cadell in chapter 27 is called Singular Negativity Towards Political Universality, and the possibility of thinking this negativity of the subject. We are all one in lack, I think, as Helen Rollins has talked about. And I think that is extremely important. And if we don't do that, then political projects are not going to be a management of a negativity. They're probably going to be utopian, either in a nostalgic way or a futuristic way. This is very problematically. And we can say, so as Cadell writes, in terms of epistemology, we have an attempt to ground our symbolic knowledge of constructive methods in this very self-impossibility, as opposed to its fantasized imaginary completion, and in this way are open to a new perspective on failure and mistake in general. If we take this seriously, it has political ramifications and social ramifications. And if we don't have transformations in those fields, we're probably going to destroy ourselves. So the stakes are very high. I think, and then of course the combination of Hegel, Nietzsche, and Lacan together can help with this problem. And one might suggest that without the science of logic, we can't really approach Lacan properly. I appreciate the class that Cadell taught on the Ecri, very difficult text, and Cadell really brought it to life. He will talk about that class here, and I think that becomes very important. I also like what he wrote here, because there is this idea that philosophy needs psychoanalysis, and Badiou even basically says that philosophy today without psychoanalysis is doomed, and we might think of it like what Cadell writes on page 597, a philosophy that has worked through Lacan recognizes that it is not enough to escape from Plato's cave, which conversely would mean one without Lacan would think it was enough. But to continue, one must become one's own first cause, and to become one's own first cause is to open the conditions of possibility to reconstitute the myths for the real of our time, inclusive of magic, science, dialectics, and religion. As we accelerate towards technological singularity, the tensions will grow, and philosophers who have moved through Lacan beyond Lacan will be more necessary than ever. I think that is very powerful. He will then talk about in chapter 9, he mentions Boothby, which I think it is interesting to think Boothby. He'll talk about McGowan. I do like what Cadell said in our talk, that a lot of the conversation that needs to be had is putting together C.S. Lewis and Lacan. I think there's really something to that. I think he talks about he's going to be talking about patty politics with Millar, Isabel Millar. He has a lovely review of the presentations of writing for first calls. I think that's very, very important. He is also going to, he just maps out very, very well the political and social consequences of if we fail to move through Lacan. And he also, with this wonderful paper with Davoud, the wonderful Davoud Gosley, I think there is this idea that data can save us, that all we need is more data, more information, we won't fall into these mistakes. I think he shows in this paper with Davoud that is not the case. He has a wonderful conversation with Davoud on the channel that I really like. Chapter 33, Homostasis to Scythome, I think is an important work. And ultimately, the end of the book is going to be pointing toward atheism as the truth of Christianity and Christian atheism. And we just had a conference on that. And it's going to be tied to, so much is going to ride on us passing through subjective destitution in a death of the big other. If we do not have a death of the big other, then our political, sociology, economic systems are going to form in some sort of non-relation with the big other, with the non in parentheses. Like either it's a direct relation, more necrotic, or neurotic, or it's going to be a non-relation where we define ourselves according to the abandonment of the big other. It doesn't really matter. The identity will form in relation to a big other, and you have to pass through, as Isaac talks about in Christian atheism. You have to experience the death of the big other, like Jesus on the cross. If this does not occur, if we don't have the thought foundations, drive myths, and the confidence in our social analysis to believe that this is necessary, then when it comes to the process of subjective destitution, we simply won't. We'll abandon ship. We won't go through the work. So the stakes are very high. And I think it's proper that Cadell ends the book on the question of Christian atheism. And I suggest the conference we went through. I think basically the demands of Christian atheism, and I've also talked about atheist Christianity, the demands of it will basically be too great without thought foundations, drive myths, and social analysis. That those are the kind of the prerequisites and the equipment one needs to go forth on the work that needs to be done. And if one picks up a copy of Real Speculations today, they are going a long way to being properly prepared for the work that needs to be done today, so that our humanity may be extended convivially versus replaced via manipulation, so that we are ready for that which we cannot predict, and so that we prove ourselves having lived in a manner that was fitting for this historic moment. And I think Real Speculations is perfect for that preparation. It is a book that I would suggest to everyone who is alive today, who wants to take seriously the moment and tarry with the negativities, that if we so do, can generate the virtue by which we might be able to experience the love that moves the sun and other stars. To pick up Real Speculations, you can find it on Amazon with Cadell Lass. Please visit philosophyportal.org to learn more about the book and the work that Philosophy Portal is doing. And thank you so much for your time.